Welcome back to Snooze Scholar. Here, the world slows down. Thoughts drift like smoke, and even the darkest questions can be met with quiet curiosity. Tonight, we step into the shadows, not to fear them, but to understand them. Because hidden within every story, behind every hero, there is always someone else. Someone darker, someone broken, or brilliant. Someone we're not supposed to root for. And yet, sometimes, we do. This is the story of villains. The monsters, the masterminds, the manipulators, the charming devils, the quiet liars, the ones who burn the world, and the ones who make us wonder what we might burn too. Why do we love them? Why are we fascinated by those who betray, deceive, destroy? What part of our own mind stirs when they enter the scene? Tonight, we'll explore not just the characters we call villains, but the psychology behind them, the archetypes, the darkness, the desire, and the strange comfort we find in watching the world through the eyes of the one who breaks the rules. So lie back, let your breath settle. There are no nightmares here, only reflections, only shadows that move quietly beneath the surface of us all. We begin not with fear, but with understanding, long before we had movies. Before novels, stage plays, or even written language, we had stories. And in every story, there was a conflict, a struggle, a choice between light and dark. The villain is not a modern invention. They are ancient, woven into our oldest myths and whispered warnings. They wear many faces, demons, tricksters, tyrants, beasts, but they all serve the same purpose, to show us what we fear, and who we might become if we let go of the light. In psychology, this darkness is called the shadow. Carl Jung described it not as evil, but as everything we hide from ourselves. Our jealousy, our anger, our cruelty, our desire to hurt, to lie, to dominate. The shadow is not a monster we fight. It is the part of us we pretend doesn't exist. And that's where the villain lives. The villain is not separate from the hero. They are the reflection, the distorted mirror that asks, what if the pain was too much? What if the hunger never stopped? What if the hero had nothing left to lose? In myth, this often took literal form. In Norse legends, Loki is the mischief maker, clever, chaotic, and necessary. In Egyptian stories, Set kills his own brother Osiris, not just out of hate, but envy and insecurity. In Greek myth, Hades is not the devil, but a ruler of the unseen, a reminder that not all darkness is evil. These villains were not just evil for evil's sake. They were expressions of imbalance, of forgotten wounds, of repressed desire. The villain, at their core, is rarely just wrong. They are often wounded. They seek control because they once had none. They seek chaos because the world once ignored them. They seek power because somewhere something was taken. And when we see them, we don't always recoil. Sometimes we relate. We see our own shadow, the part of us that wants to break the rules, that feels misunderstood, that wonders what would happen if we stopped being polite, stopped being quiet, stopped being small. The villain gives voice to that question. And that is why they matter. Because in understanding them, we begin to understand ourselves. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when villains aren't pure evil, but sympathetic, tragic, even lovable, because sometimes the villain doesn't fall. Sometimes they're pushed. Not all villains cackle. Not all of them raise swords, or burn kingdoms, or sneer in shadows. Some villains cry, some love, some try, and it's in those moments, when the villain looks human, that something strange happens inside us. We hesitate, we listen, we feel empathy. This is the space where storytelling becomes powerful, because it's no longer just a tale of good and evil. It becomes a reflection of something real, a world where people are complicated and pain can twist even the kindest intentions. Why do we care about characters who do terrible things? Because often we see why they did them. We meet the villain who was abandoned, who was betrayed, who was shaped by cruelty before they ever had a chance to choose kindness. We see the child inside the monster, the heartbreak beneath the rage, the logic, however flawed, behind the actions. And we begin to understand. That's the key difference between a villain and a caricature. A true villain believes they are justified. They are not simply doing wrong. They believe they are righting a wrong done to them. Think of Magneto, shaped by war and genocide, convinced that only force can protect his kind. Or Killmonger, whose anger speaks to generations of suffering, his methods violent, but his grief undeniable. Think of Anakin Skywalker, not born evil, but slowly broken by fear, loss, and manipulation. He didn't want to rule. He wanted to save the person he loved. We don't condone them, but we get them. And in that understanding, our moral lines blur. Because empathy doesn't ask us to agree. It asks us to imagine, to step inside another's pain, and feel it for just a moment. And when we do, we realize that villainy is not born in darkness. It often begins in heartbreak, in fear, in loneliness. It grows in silence. It hardens in rejection. And sometimes it could have been stopped. That's what makes these stories powerful. Not just because they entertain, but because they remind us how thin the line can be between love and hate, justice and revenge, hero and villain. In the next chapter, we'll step away from sympathy and into fascination. Because some villains aren't tragic. They're charismatic, stylish, addictive. And we don't just understand them, we enjoy them. There are villains we fear, villains we pity, and then there are villains we love, the ones who steal the spotlight, who speak in poetry while pulling the trigger, who wear suits instead of scars, or smile as they set fire to the rules we quietly resent. Why do we love them? Because charisma is powerful, and when combined with rebellion, confidence, and clarity of purpose, it becomes magnetic. These villains don't beg for sympathy. They demand attention, and we give it freely. The Joker, chaotic and theatrical, becomes a mirror to society's hypocrisy, not because he's right, but because he's honest about the madness no one else admits. Hannibal Lecter, cold and cultivated, terrifies us not with rage, but with elegance, the unsettling blend of intellect and appetite. Cersei Lannister, cruel and calculating, draws us in because we see the mother, the survivor, the woman who refuses to break even when the world conspires to break her. And then there's Moriarty, or Littlefinger, or even Tyler Durden. Figures who aren't just dangerous, they're seductive. They speak with conviction. They dress like confidence. They move through the story as if it belongs to them. And sometimes it does. These are not villains born from pain. They are villains born from agency. They choose darkness with open eyes. And that fascinates us. Because in our daily lives, so much is restrained. We bite our tongues. We play our roles. We fold ourselves to fit the world. But the charismatic villain does the opposite. They speak what we're too afraid to say. They cross lines we fantasize about crossing. They reject shame. They break expectations. And in doing so, they become oddly liberating. They remind us that power, when combined with vision, can rewrite the script, even if that vision is terrifying. Of course, it's fiction, but in the safety of that fiction, we explore sides of ourselves we rarely acknowledge: desire, control, ego, anarchy. And when we walk away, we feel changed, not corrupted, just more aware of what we're capable of how fragile the boundary is between order and chaos, and of how compelling it can be to dance briefly in the dark. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into that dance, into the psychology behind our fascination with fear, and how danger can feel almost comforting. Because sometimes the villain doesn't chase us. Sometimes we follow them. There's something strange about fear. We avoid it, and yet we seek it. We flinch from it in life, but chase it in stories. And at the center of this contradiction sits the villain. Because fear is not just a signal of danger. It's a doorway to focus, to clarity, to intensity. When we're afraid, truly afraid, the world sharpens. Time slows. Distraction vanishes. We become present. And that presence, that emotional surge, can feel exhilarating. Villains, especially the most compelling ones, know this. They don't just threaten, They control the rhythm of fear. They decide when to speak, when to strike, when to wait. They become the drumbeat of tension, and we follow that beat, breath held, pulse racing. But it's not just the danger that draws us in, it's what it reveals. Villains strip away the masks. They corner the hero. They force truth into the light. And in doing so, they become honest. Honest about what power looks like. Honest about what people are willing to do when pushed. Honest about the parts of the world and the self that polite society prefers to ignore. This is why our fascination with villains often deepens when their fear becomes philosophical. When the villain doesn't just pose a threat, but a question. Why do you follow rules that hurt you? What if the system is broken? What if I'm not the monster, but the mirror? Suddenly, the fear becomes more than survival. It becomes intellectual, existential, a challenge. We feel the fear, but we don't look away. Because deep down, part of us wants to understand. Not because we want to become the villain, but because we want to know how close we already are. This is the loop. Fear leads to focus. Focus leads to fascination. Fascination leads to understanding. And understanding makes the villain unforgettable, even when we don't agree, even when we shouldn't admire them. Something lingers. A line of dialogue, a cold stare, a moment that made you shiver, not because it was evil, but because it was true. In the next chapter, we'll take this deeper, because while fear draws us in, what shapes our idea of the villain more than anything is evolution itself. Villains aren't just story tools. They're ancient, hardwired, and they may have been necessary. Before there were books, before firelight stories and painted myths, before language itself, there was danger. And somewhere in the tall grass, or the darkness beyond the cave, or the eyes of another human, was something watching. The human brain is ancient. It was shaped not by comfort, but by survival. And in that shaping, villains were not invented. They were sensed, not as characters, but as threats. A rustle in the bushes, a stranger who doesn't smile, a tribe that takes more than it gives, a leader who rises too fast and looks at power too long. Long before storytelling, we developed a radar for risk. We evolved to spot patterns, to notice who was too angry, too clever, too quiet. The villain archetype didn't begin as fiction. It began as instinct. The manipulator, the traitor, the predator. These are roles we've feared for tens of thousands of years, because ignoring them meant death. Even now, the amygdala, a small cluster of neurons deep in the brain, reacts faster to threat than reason. It lights up at certain facial expressions. It tenses at unpredictability. It remembers fear long after logic has moved on. And so, when we watch a villain on screen, or hear one in a story, we aren't just entertained. we're activating ancient code. We lean in. We analyze. We feel the rise of heart rate and the prickling of skin. Not because we believe it's real, but because something inside us once did. Even children who've never faced real betrayal can identify the villain in a fairy tale. They know who to distrust. They know when the music changes. They know, because villains aren't new. They are echoes of evolutionary survival, the shape we give to fear, to caution, to conflict. And yet, even as we feared them, we also needed them. The villain in the story sharpens the hero, just as the threat in life sharpened the tribe. They brought clarity, forced adaptation, defined who we were by showing us what we refused to become. In this way, the villain is not just a threat. They're a boundary, a challenge, a test. And perhaps that's why, even now, they still hold our attention. Because deep inside, we are still watching the tall grass, still listening for the silence, still trying to decide, do I run or do I face it? In the next chapter, we'll explore how modern media has reshaped this instinct, how style, voice, and culture affect who we see as the villain, and why some villains look nothing like threats at all. The villain used to wear scars. Their eyes burned, their voice rasped. They lived in shadow and wore it like armor. But something changed. Modern villains don't always hiss or scream. They walk in perfectly tailored suits. They speak in calm, poetic cadence. They stand still while others panic. They smile when they shouldn't, and we remember them for it. Villainy in the age of cinema and design became beautiful. Media learned to reshape our instincts. It took the archetype of fear and wrapped it in aesthetics. Lighting, music, costuming, dialogue, all conspire to seduce the audience before the story even unfolds. Think of the sharp lines of Maleficent's silhouette, the cold elegance of Silva in Skyfall, the haunting calm of HAL 9000's voice, the devilish charm of Tom Riddle long before he became Voldemort. These villains do not repel. They attract. They are composed, witty, symmetrical, controlled, and in a world that often feels chaotic and messy, control becomes alluring. Media knows this. It crafts villains not just to threaten, but to mesmerize. Slow camera movements, soft, deliberate dialogue, a sense of knowing more than everyone else in the room. We are told, by instinct, to fear the unpredictable, but we are told by culture to admire the composed. And when the two merge, when the danger is quiet and polished, something in us is disarmed. We begin to listen to the villain, to consider their point, to echo their logic long after the film ends. This is where aesthetics become dangerous, not because they glamorize evil, but because they blur the signal. They make us forget what we're watching. It becomes less about right and wrong, and more about style. It's no accident that fan culture surrounds villains with as much love as heroes. With fan art, quotes, theme music, and entire social media accounts dedicated to villain eras. In these portrayals, villains are no longer just characters. They are icons, mood boards, aesthetic archetypes, and in some ways, they tell us more about ourselves than we'd like to admit. What we find attractive, what we think power looks like, what we secretly want to be if consequences didn't exist. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when those lines blur entirely. When the villain isn't a villain anymore, because the hero might be just as flawed. We'll explore antiheroes, corrupted protagonists, and the shifting definition of what it means to be good. Because sometimes the most dangerous villains are the ones wearing the hero's mask, and the villain wore black. The lines were clear, the story was simple. But stories, like people, evolve. Now, the characters we root for don't always follow the rules. They don't always smile. They don't always save without consequence. Sometimes, the person we cheer for isn't entirely good, and we're okay with that. Welcome to the age of the antihero. The antihero isn't evil. They're just flawed, damaged, sharp where a hero is soft, silent where a hero would speak, brutal where a hero would show mercy. They don't want to save the world. Sometimes they just want to survive it. Walter White, Tony Soprano, Dexter Morgan, even Batman, brooding in shadows, breaking bones to protect a city that doesn't know how to thank him. These are not villains, but they aren't saints either. They operate in gray dash because the world they live in is painted that way. We admire them not because they are perfect, but because they try, despite their damage. And in them, we see a different kind of strength. A resilience. A refusal to conform to a system that has failed them. There's something deeply human in that. Because real people don't fit clean roles. We make mistakes. We regret. We compromise. And when we see a character do the same dash, when they lie but for love, when they kill but for justice, when they hurt but they still care, we don't reject them. We lean in because the anti-hero is messy, and so are we. Their journey doesn't always end in glory. Sometimes it ends in tragedy, in consequence, in redemption, or the lack of it. But we watch anyway, because we understand that sometimes being good isn't clean. Sometimes doing the right thing feels wrong, and sometimes the people who save the world are the same people who once wanted to burn it. The rise of the antihero has changed the way we see villains too. It's no longer about good versus evil. It's about pain versus purpose, choice versus survival, identity versus expectation. And in that complexity, storytelling finds its richest ground, where no one is entirely right, no one is entirely wrong, and everyone, is trying. In our next chapter, we'll go back in time to the old stories, the myths and folklore, and explore how villains were used not to entertain, but to teach. Because before the villain was a symbol of power, they were a warning. Before the villain became stylish, before they monologued in glass towers or moved chess pieces in back rooms. They lived in stories carved into stone, painted on cave walls, whispered by firelight. They weren't characters, they were warnings. In myth and folklore, the villain wasn't just evil. They were consequence. They were what happened when you wandered too far, when you disobeyed, when you challenged the gods, or forgot your place. The monsters were shaped by fear, but also by values. They told you what your culture believed and what it needed you to remember. In Greek myth, Medusa turned men to stone, not because she was born a monster, but because she was cursed. She was a victim, transformed into a warning, and yet even now, she remains iconic, feared, misunderstood, powerful. In Norse myth, Loki wasn't purely evil. He was clever, unpredictable, a necessary chaos that the gods tolerated, until he went too far. He reminded people that wit, when turned bitter, could destroy even the divine. In Japanese folklore, there are yokai, spirits that trick, tempt, punish, and haunt. Some are mischievous, some are vengeful, but almost all have a lesson buried in their chaos. Respect nature, honor your ancestors, beware pride. African legends feature beings like the tokolosho, a creature sent to cause illness, fear, or death, but often only when the balance of community has been broken. And in indigenous North American stories, the Wendigo roams the cold, a spirit of hunger and greed. It does not just eat. It consumes people who have already surrendered to selfishness. These aren't just scary tales. They are moral codes, wrapped in shadow, told so children and adults would remember. Be kind, be humble, be careful what you chase. What's striking is how many of these villains are not simply destroyed. They are respected, feared, yes, but also understood to be part of the world, not separate from it, because old cultures knew something we often forget. That darkness isn't just out there, it's within us. And stories were how we kept it in check. So while modern villains might charm and dazzle, ancient villains endured. They weren't made to entertain. They were made to endure in memory, to haunt the edges of dreams, and sharpen the lines between what we are and what we might become if we forget who we are. In the next chapter, we'll return to reality and explore what psychology tells us about real-life villainy. The people who wear no costume, who make no speech, but whose traits match patterns we've studied, feared, and sometimes even followed. Because the most chilling truth of all is that villains don't only exist in fiction. Stories give us symbols, But sometimes those symbols walk among us, not with glowing eyes or capes or claws, but with smiles, with charm, with confidence that never quite blinks. Because real-life villainy doesn't arrive in dramatic music. It doesn't announce itself with lightning. It blends in. Psychologists have identified a group of traits known as the dark triad. A pattern seen in certain people whose behavior mirrors what we often call evil, but whose actions are shaped more by personality than by destiny. The three traits are narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. Individually, they can exist in small amounts, in ambition, strategy, emotional control, but together, they create something colder, more dangerous, more familiar to the villains we know. Narcissism is an obsession with the self, a hunger for praise, a belief that one's worth is unquestionable, even at the cost of others. Machiavellianism is manipulation without remorse. It plans, calculates, controls. It doesn't lie for gain. It lies because the truth is just another tool. Psychopathy is the most severe. A lack of empathy, a shallow emotional range, a disconnection from guilt, fear, or love. Not all who have these traits are criminals. Many operate in boardrooms, politics, finance, and entertainment. They thrive in power because power doesn't demand kindness. It rewards results. And that's what makes them difficult to spot. They are not monstrous. They are effective, efficient, focused. Just like the villains we watch on screen, they know how to present themselves. How to win trust, how to wear the costume of charisma. But beneath that surface, there is often emptiness. Not fire, not rage, just a quiet, unreachable cold. Psychology doesn't use words like evil. It uses patterns, behavior, history. And in those patterns, we find echoes of the very archetypes that stories have warned us about for thousands of years. The seductive leader, the calculating betrayer, the charming liar. They are not fantasy. They are part of us. And part of the reason we tell stories is to keep watch for them, to remember the signs, to trust our instincts, to know that sometimes the real villain does not look like a monster. They look like someone who simply doesn't care. In our final chapter, we'll bring all of this together and ask, why do villains matter so much to us? What do they teach? What do they reveal? And why, even when we know better, do we still love the bad guy? We've walked beside monsters. We've seen the tyrants, the tricksters, the fallen heroes, the charming liars. We've explored ancient myths, real-life traits, and the slow descent from justice into vengeance. And now we ask, why do we love them? Why do we return to their stories? Why do we quote them, draw them, defend them? Why do we sometimes feel more for the villain than for the hero? The answer isn't dark. It's human. We love villains because they tell the truth, or at least a truth we're not always brave enough to say aloud. They show us the cost of pain, the power of desire, the consequences of neglect. They remind us that rules can be broken, and sometimes need to be. Villains live in the places we avoid: anger, obsession, grief, pride, control. And when we watch them, we see a part of ourselves that we don't always want to admit is there. But it's not evil that draws us in. It's honesty. Villains act on what we suppress. They demand what we deny. They fall in ways that feel real, and they rise in ways that feel earned. We don't love them because they hurt others. We love them because they hurt too, because they make mistakes, because they want something so badly it burns, because they show us what we might become if we were a little less afraid. In loving villains, we aren't celebrating cruelty. We are acknowledging shadow. We are saying quietly, I've felt that too. I've been close to the edge. I understand. And in doing so, we soften, not toward evil, but toward ourselves. Because every person carries a shadow. Every person wrestles with things they don't want to feel. And every person, even the best of us, has, at some point, wanted to burn it all down. The villain gives us space to feel that, safely, to understand it, to forgive it. And that is the true power of the bad guy. They do not just challenge the hero. They challenge us to look inward, to sit with discomfort, to grow. So as you rest now, with this story behind you, know this: you are not broken for relating to the villain. You are human, curious, capable of great good, and aware of the complexity that lives beneath it. Let that comfort you. You are not alone in the dark. You are simply learning to see within it. Good night, traveler, and thank you for stepping into the shadow.